When I bought my home in an Alabama flood zone more than a decade ago, it was a nightmare. I was given the wrong flood insurance information. I was given the wrong flood zone. I almost lost out on a home because I did not know the coverages that I needed. I did not understand my flood risks. And that's why in this video, if you're an Alabama homeowner or a potential Alabama homeowner that's looking at maybe purchasing in one of these high-risk areas or even a low-risk area, I'm going to show you everything you need to know so that you can avoid the mistakes I made more than a decade ago. So let's get started. Hi, I'm Chris, the flood insurance carrier. More than a decade ago, I bought a house in a flood zone just like this right here. It was a disaster. And today, I'm going to teach you how to avoid some of the mistakes that I made when it came to purchasing a home in Alabama. We're going to talk about things like flood insurance cost in Alabama. We're going to talk about what is your flood risk in Alabama, understanding your flood zone. How much coverage do you need? Is it required in Alabama? Understanding the difference in your flood insurance options in Alabama. We're going to discuss all these things in this video. And look, I understand that you may not want to watch the whole video. That's exactly why we've built chapters for each section for you so that you can make it quicker for you if you're just trying to get to a certain point. So make sure to watch each one of these sections in this video as we cover these pretty in depth for you. Also, don't forget to share, subscribe, and like the channel below. Is flood insurance required in Alabama? There's all kinds of flood zones in Alabama. But in order to understand if flood insurance is required, we've really got to look at two specific things here. We're looking at non-special flood hazard areas, special flood hazard areas, also called maybe minimum risk and moderate or higher risk. But when we're talking about non-special, we're talking about things like flood zone X. Typically, if you have a property in flood zone X, flood insurance is not going to be required. Now, if you have a property in the special flood hazard area, which may be flood zone A or AE, or if you're on the coast, flood zone V, it is typically going to be required if you have a mortgage. Typically, flood insurance is not going to be required if you don't have a mortgage, unless you've taken out disaster assistance and you're having to pay back maybe a disaster loan. There could be some certain situations here. But this is when flood insurance is required. Now, even if it's not required, do you need flood insurance in Alabama? Yes, everybody needs it because traditionally, flood damage is not covered by your Alabama homeowners insurance policy. So you want to remember that. Imagine losing everything in a flood. Did you really know how much coverage you needed? Are you going to be disappointed come claims time? Coverage limits. What exactly do you need when it comes to flood insurance? Let's talk about the National Flood Insurance Program first. Now, the National Flood Insurance Program on buildings like this right here, building coverage up to $250,000 on the building and $100,000 on contents here up to 2024. That could be changing in the future. But those are the current coverages that they offer. They don't offer anything outside that building or contents coverage. They don't offer replacement cost on contents either. Now let's talk about private flood insurance. What a difference it can be in the National Flood Insurance Program. Remember, private flood insurance does not limit their coverages to $250,000 on a building. They don't limit it to $100,000 on contents. They also provide replacement costs on contents. Now, these can be big, especially if you're trying to get more than that $250,000. They potentially also offer additional living expense. Remember, additional living expenses, say your house floods. Let's take the customer we had in Nebraska whose house flooded in 2018 and she didn't have a place to go. But her neighbors had a National Flood Insurance Program policy. She had a private policy that had additional living expense. She had a hotel paid for 6 months while her house was being prepared. This was a major financial blanket for her. It took a lot of stress off of her compared to what her neighbors had. So this is one of the benefits here of having additional living expenses on your policy. But remember, only private flood insurance offers it. So these are some of the differences between the National Flood Insurance Program and private flood insurance when it comes to coverages. Does my Alabama home insurance policy cover flood damage? But in order to understand flood damage, we've got to understand what is a flood. We hear from people every day, hey, my pipe burst, my toilet backed up, my house flooded. But was it really a flood? So let's talk about that flood definition according to the federal government. And here we're talking about, like you see here behind me, 2 different structures or 2 acres have to be inundated with normal dry water, like the water from the lake, could be rainfall. It could be even potentially a swimming pool that's overtaken several properties in a rare situation. It has to be surface water. That means that water cannot be coming up out of the ground that causes this damage, which we see a lot with basements sometimes in Alabama. So that's what flood damage is. Now, when it comes to your home insurance policy, it's typically not covering that water damage that's coming from outside the home. It's typically covering what happens in the home, like your pipe bursting, your toilet backing up. So it comes back to the question of, do you need home insurance in Alabama? You absolutely do, because home insurance in Alabama typically does not cover flood damage. So when it comes to understanding your flood damage in Alabama, this is how it works. We're talking about understanding Alabama floods. Look, there's a lot of different flood zones in Alabama, whether we're in Mobile, Montgomery, Birmingham, Tuscaloosa, Huntsville. All the risks are different, and so are the flood zones. zones. But when we're talking about flood zones here, we're talking about non-special flood hazard areas and special flood hazard areas first. These are areas that are going to be in the minimal risk, low required areas. These are also referred to typically as flood zone X. This means if you have a mortgage in these areas, typically flood insurance is not going to be required. Now they say minimum risk, but it's important to remember that about 30% of flood claims actually come out of these areas. So even if you're in a low risk area, it's still recommended that you carry flood insurance, since typically Alabama home insurance policies don't cover flood damage. Now let's talk about the special flood hazard areas. And here we're talking about flood zone A, AE, and V. First of all, let's compare flood zone A and AE here. The big difference here is these both are in the 100-year flood area. The difference is flood zone A typically does not have a base flood elevation. This means that FEMA has not determined the actual level that flooding can come to, while with AE it has. That's many times why it's considered to be moderate versus high risk. Now this means that flood zone A, it can be challenging to change your flood zone because a base flood elevation hasn't been determined yet. So knowing that base flood elevation level though, that can also tell you what level you should build a house at, or if your level is above that, you might be able to change your flood zone. These are all things that can help you understand the difference between flood zone A and flood zone AE in Alabama. Now it's important to understand that whether you're in A or AE, it has no impact on your federal flood insurance rates anymore. Now it still impacts some private, but it's pretty minimal. So just remember, typically flood zones are not going to have much of an impact anymore on your flood insurance rates. It's going to be more based on the flood risk. Now let's talk about flood zone V, also called coastal flood zones. Now, these might be areas like in Fairhope, Alabama, Orange Beach. You might be even in Mobile, where you're right along the water. These are areas that are exposed to storm surge. And you can see the water right here behind me. Just imagine standing right there in that water line where that water comes rushing in during a hurricane. These are coastal flood zone areas. Now these areas might have different requirements when you're building, called freeboarding, where you have to build above what FEMA's levels are. It just depends on where you're located at. But these are what the different flood zones mean in Alabama, whether flood insurance is required or not. Remember, the National Flood Insurance Program offers building coverage up to $250,000 on your actual building. So remember, we're talking about actual building coverage. We're talking about like things right here behind me that are physically attached to the building, like this island right here. When we're talking about contents coverage, we're talking about things like here on the counter that you can see right here behind me. We're not talking about things like the dishwasher or refrigerators on that first floor. Those technically could fall under building coverage. Now, if it's a basement, freezers and refrigerators would typically fall under contents coverage. So that's how coverages work when it comes to the amount of coverage. Remember, the National Flood Insurance Program, as we mentioned, on residential properties, these are typically properties of 40 units or less, or a single family home up to $250,000. And then you've got contents coverage up to $100,000. But also remember, if this is not a primary residence for you, the National Flood Insurance Program is charging you a surcharge of $225 on top of what you already have. So if you see that surcharge on there called the Home Insurance Affordability Act surcharge, that's what that is. So that's the National Flood Insurance Program. Now, let's get us a little bit into coverages with the National Flood Insurance Program. We talked about the amount of coverage available and all these things. Now let's talk about replacement costs versus actual cash value. Now it's important to understand that with the National Flood Insurance Program, they have some conditions to make sure that you can get coverages up to $250,000. Their condition is that you've got to insure this property for 80% of the replacement cost. That's the actual cost to rebuild, or the max coverage available. And I'll tell you a story about a customer from Texas that came to us many years ago. Had like 4 flood claims, and each one of the flood claims only paid about $15,000, $20,000. She couldn't figure it out. Her policy was for $100,000. And the reason why the payout was so low was because she was not insuring for 80% of the replacement cost. So these were defaulting to an actual cash value, which had significant depreciation taking off the claim. Come claims time, this was a pretty disappointing thing for her. Now, thankfully, she's got a policy in place that's got that 80% on there, so she doesn't have to worry about that anymore. But you've got to understand that when it comes to the National Flood Insurance Program here, what do I need to know to get the best coverage through the National Flood Insurance Program? And it's that 80% rule. Now, we see people every day come claim time that are really disappointed because they didn't have this in place. Now let's talk about contents. What about replacement costs on content? As I shoot this video here in 2024, currently the National Flood Insurance Program does not offer replacement cost on content, only actual cash value. So you want to remember that when you're insuring your contents. You also want to remember, typically contents is very limited in basements with the National Flood Insurance Program. It's typically only covering things that make the building safe. So when you go to finish out that basement and you've got flood insurance coverage with the National Flood Insurance Program, you want to remember that. So the higher your flood risk score is, traditionally, the higher your flood premiums could be, not just today, tomorrow, but 36 months from now. Because remember, you want to prepare when you're purchasing this flood insurance of, hey, what are my rates gonna be today? What are they gonna be next year and the year after? You wanna make sure that affordability stays in play here. So maybe you're buying a property where flood zones are gonna change, if flood risk score is gonna change because of things that are changing in your area. Maybe your community is pulling out the National Flood Insurance Program, and that could have a big impact. These potentially are all things that your flood risk score could tell you. So when you're getting that quote from whoever you're getting it from, have them use a replacement cost estimator to tell you what you need to look at. Now here in 2024 in residential properties, what we recommend starting at is about $150 to $175 a square foot. That gives you an idea on building coverage of how much you actually need. I hope that this video has provided some value for you if you're an Alabama homeowner looking at purchasing a home in Alabama when it comes to understanding all these different flood risks, your flood insurance options, and really anything you need to know about flood insurance. I'm Chris, the flood insurance guru, and I look forward to speaking to you in our next video. Thank you.